So what I'm interested to explore today is whether the model for innovation we have around the world will in fact deliver a collective future. And I want to argue very clearly that it won't, and it won't in some very radical ways, and that we will need to change our model of innovation dramatically if we are to see its benefits distributed equally and particularly on a place basis. I want to begin by observing that the way our current model of innovation works around the world delivers its benefits with a radical inequality that is ultimately imperiling our own system. What drives the kind of essence of how our globalized innovation economy works is, if you like, a principle of aggregation. The inner dynamism of the global economy that we have in this internet age enables you to win if you can aggregate. If you can aggregate to get scale, you can win. If you can capture network effects, those which dominate the internet businesses from Google and Facebook, Amazon to eBay, you can win. If you can capture and own intangible assets, intellectual property, brand or talent, all of which you can leverage globally, you can win. And the reality is that that aggregation is going on at scale and has not ceased throughout this period of our economic growth. We've seen now 2/3 of America's, kind of, if you choose to break them down that way, 900 industries become significantly more concentrated in the last decade. 1/10 of the US economy is now made up of industries where there are four or less firms control 2/3 of the market. That's a dynamism we of course see and know very well here in Australia. And we see small numbers of players generating more and more of the profits. In the 20 years from 1994 onwards, the top 100 companies in the United States went from generating a third of the nominal GDP to nearly half of it. So 100 companies in the US dominate the economy in a completely disproportionate way. And the top 10% of the world's companies generate nearly 80% of its profits. And onto the balance sheets of those companies, huge amounts of cash are growing, over 800 billion a year. And that, combined with their market dominance, has actually seen entrepreneurship shrink in the United States and shrink in multiple countries. We celebrate in a conference like this, you could be misled to think innovation was alive and well. In fact, the global innovation ecosystem is not alive and well and in great health. There are moments of excitement, but in fact, the trends are not positive. And as we know, we've seen those in Australia. Now, if aggregation to individuals and to companies is one thing, we are also aggregating to place, and this is where I get particularly worried. It was, and Thomas Freeman put it boldly once upon a time, that the world would be flat, in a sense that economic opportunity would be evenly distributed. What's turned out is the world is not flat, it's actually very uneven. If we look at the distribution of income and wealth around their world, there are in fact mountains. We have great mountains of wealth surrounded by vast plains, and often with some very deep depressions and even sinkholes that people struggle ever to get out of. Now, that aggregation to place, to particular locations on the planet, is driven by a force economists have long understood called agglomeration economics, where production is cheaper because of a whole cluster of economic activity. And those, it turns out, those forces accelerate in an age of intangibles where brand networks drive the capacity to create value, and you capture talent. So the old agglomeration economics now are a new agglomeration economics, which further concentrate into particular geographies in the world, wealth and prosperity. In fact, it's so much so that when we talk about innovation, we almost inevitably talk about place names, starting with that famous valley. Actually, innovation gets talked about in geographic terms in a globalized world. And if you think about it, we get a sense of just how concentrated it is. If we were to use venture capital as a proxy for where entrepreneurial value is being created, what that reveals is a picture that shows just how few places on the planet innovation is really aggregating. The 5 leading global metropolitan areas for venture capital investment account for nearly half of such investment. And those same places account for just 0.8% of the world's population. The top 10 leading metro areas for venture capital investment account for 56% of it, or just 1.4% of the world's population. And the top 20 global metros for venture capital investment account for nearly 3/4 of it, and that amounts to just 3% of the population. So what we're seeing is place aggregating innovation dramatically and creating wealth and prosperity in those places where others are left behind. And the reality of this aggregation is that we are not creating a collective future on the model we're currently pursuing. It's a divided future. And I live in a region where we experience that firsthand. Now, it may be that Tasmania is a flavour of the month, and it's certainly a lovely place to visit, and with some nice infrastructure investment going on. But the underlying reality is that income per capita is 20% lower than the national average. This is in one country. We've got one state where people are 20% poorer. They live shorter lives by a number of years. And between 2012 and 2016, median incomes actually declined by close to 11%. And when it comes to our health profile, it's only matched by the Northern Territory. But we are not alone. It's just a snapshot, and it's one that I'm personally very close to. Death rates in rural and remote Australia and outer regional areas, 35% higher than in metropolitan areas. People are literally dying outside these places where wealth is aggregating. And in Australia, that kind of shorter life is reflected actually right across more regional parts of Australia, where people live by a matter of years shorter lives. And that's before we get to Indigenous populations, which of course is a different kind of national scandal. Now, in reality, this has been clear for some time. Enrico Moretti, in his really important book, The New Geography of Jobs, put this on the map, but it has continued unchanged. And it's a reality I think we too easily ignore in large cities, like we have around Australia, the most urbanised society in the world. That is until we start to see the protests. Trump's America, which is why back then I thought things would go bad because we'd neglected such a vast swathe of people. And of course, we start to see it here when people elect hunters and shooters and fishers in rural and regional places where the political parties aren't addressing their needs. Or in the kind of liberal progressive France, when people start to come from regional areas in yellow vests and make a noise because they're not carrying along on the journey. So the reality of this is whichever side of politics you're playing on, whether it's the kind of trickle-down economics of the right or the kind of government will save you politics of the left, both models have failed. They are not delivering for the many places we have around the world and indeed very much in our own country. The only way I think we get out of this is to change the innovation agenda, to move to what is a place-based innovation agenda that can deliver those benefits far more equitably. And there are three ideas that can help drive that I want to touch on today. And that really starts with the notion of how do you construct, the very core of this is how do you construct place-based advantage. The rules of the game can't change. We can't retreat to some rural utopianism, or that's not going to work. We've actually the kind of model of the free market global economy is not going to go into reverse. And one thing we do know is in that kind of economy, the notion that we once relied on of comparative advantage, that everyone would get something they were good at, actually doesn't cut it. It's not distributing wealth or opportunity in the ways we thought. We have to construct advantage. We have to construct place-based advantage, and we have to do it without some simplistic picking of winners strategy. So we need to set about doing that, and we need to set about doing it in the same ways that the rest of the global economy does, but recognise some limits. Small places aren't going to be able to do it on the basis of scale, and it's highly unlikely that they will be the places when network effect internet businesses or the like are born. They will have to rely on that third category I started with, which is about intangible assets. How do you create those things that can be distinctively owned, hard to take away, and can be the basis of successful competition? Now, the first of those things, I think, relies on us creating what people in some places describing as inclusive growth approaches to economic and social policy. And that really is the notion that you can, instead of moving from seeing these as two separate parts of social policy, use inclusive growth strategies to create distinctively productive local communities where the work is done. And if you think about where we have those kind of economies already, Germany's not a bad example of it. We're regionally distributed across Germany. You have single towns that do distinctively globally competitive things where they still manufacture them. And that's because you have an ecosystem of both society, education, economy working well together to do that. And it's possible to do. Indeed, not so far from one of our campuses, there's a company called Elphinstone in Burnie, which actually in Australia manages to manufacture underground mining trucks for sale all around the world. They are the best underground mining trucks that you can make anywhere, and they're globally competitive. And they've done that really by creating a whole ecology around their business that enables them to do something quite remarkable. We're shutting manufacturing of vehicles in other parts of Australia. It thrives in a small place because actually a whole lot of things have come together in a very distinctive way. And that's actually capable of replication, of being able to do that. And I think if you're interested in this direction, the RSA in Britain ran an inclusive growth commission to kind of set out a bit of a roadmap about how you could think about this. And I think it's a powerful roadmap well worth looking at. And at the core of the way they set it out, and I think it reflects the reality of a number of attempts to make this work, it is to see investment in social infrastructure as the driver both of economic growth and social mobility. And that we have a far better chance of raising our productivity and our competitiveness if we actually invest in the social infrastructure that enables towns, cities to work much better by building the human capital and connectivity around the things that those places already do reasonably well in order to make them do better and enable a much broader group of people to be engaged and do it successfully. Now, the critical thing about this kind of policy is that it needs to be done through the place. The place has to be the centre of how it's created. It has to be designed place out, not centre in. In too many places, we find governments, NGOs, and other agencies coming into places with centrally determined policy frameworks and rolling out goals that align with their plans. Those plans may not actually be the things that speak to the particular barriers and local conditions that prevent the formation of really good social capital and competitiveness and productivity in those unique places. Places are unique, they're different, they have different characters and qualities that have to be captured, leveraged and utilised to underpin it. It really matters to go about it. And if you wonder about whether that's a viable idea, there have been businesses that discover it's the only way you can do business in these places. Think the Bendigo Bank. You can get a bank in your town if the town wants the bank, if it can build enough local leadership, enough local commitment to say that's part of the social infrastructure that we want in a town. You can have it. But we don't do that with virtually all other areas of kind of investment. Imagine if the town decided it would have a policy about what was going to happen to its school, but you couldn't get the money until you had a whole community committed to seeing the education outcomes for the kids change. That's when they'd start to change, because you need a whole town committed to raising kids, not just a heroic principal and some heroic teachers. And yet we keep throwing money at these places and to virtually zero effect. So inclusive growth strategies that engage whole communities around building the social infrastructure that melds them together, and particularly around what they do distinctively well, is critical. A second notion, if it's inclusive growth strategies that we need, it's also place-based universities. And that's in a sense where I've entered the conversation. Because if we're seeking to construct those intangible assets I talked about, like intellectual property or get talent, we need to make sure that they are created locally to local needs and conditions so they can be held locally. Now, again, the UK, I think, has offered us some leadership here. The recent Civic Universities Commission produced, I think, an excellent piece of work where they looked at what happens when universities take a civic mission to actually address the particular circumstances that they face. And in the Brexit debacle that's going on there at the moment, underpinning the Brexit debacle is too many places that got left behind, which actually do have universities in them, and where they could should play a much greater role, which is what the Commission Commission was so interested in engaging in. And certainly found interesting and important examples, some of which we could replicate, we see here in Australia, where they are contributing actually to what goes on in their local environments and making a really big difference. But our university systems are not built around actually making local economies thrive and successful. We have a higher education system set up actually to drive to national and international goals, not to local goals. All of our incentives drive in the wrong direction, despite the fact that those sort of institutional presences would give us some of the greatest capacities actually to deliver local competitive advantage. We could change that. We can change the incentives. We need to incent universities actually to be focused on the local needs and conditions and opportunities that exist in their world. We've just done a kind of an evaluation of universities based on their impact. I've just started to have a look at what's come out of that. It implicitly values national and international impact over local impact. So what that's driving is universities to look over the horizon to the place-free agenda rather than actually to what would make the difference and transform their own worlds. We need to see that change significantly if we're going to get that kind of impact. Equally, we need to change the way we fund research and development. If you live in the smaller places of the world, they tend to be dominated by small to medium enterprises who don't have large R&D budgets or possibly even any R&D budget at all. And yet that makes them very hard for universities to work with on the current funding models. That, of course, could change dramatically. And the third notion that I want to talk about is the notion that if we're going to be creating these locally valuable things that can be the source of competition, we need to enable local places to secure them by securing their intangible assets at that place-based level. Now, in a way, we've understood this for a long time. It was 1935 when the French created an Institut National de Appellations d'Origine, focusing on how do you get and protect local branded areas. You know, the Côte d'Rhône was the first area to actually get protection. Now that's actually a way of thinking about how do you capture value locally, give it some real protection. But we don't do that rigorously or systematically. In Australia, we don't really do it at all. But we could and should to give that kind of local protection to the identities of what gets produced in distinctive places. Now, I'm quite delighted that the Tasmanian government has decided to create an independent statutory authority to protect a place-based brand for Tasmania itself. It's a bold notion in lots of ways to set about to protect something that actually can deliver local advantage. But we also need to make sure that our intellectual property regimes adapt to make it easier for regions to hold licenses to intellectual properties that they can defend over and against other areas. They may be to particular species that grow well in those areas, to particular modes or models of production that work well in those areas. We need intellectual property regimes that operate on a place basis, not just on their current corporate ownership or individual ownership kind of structures. They need to be able to, intellectual property needs to be able to be owned and managed at a regional level. So they're the challenges. We have a challenge of a world that is pulling ourselves apart. This innovation system is not delivering for the world. We risk those consequences damaging our politics and ultimately damaging the very system itself. There are alternatives. There are people actively exploring them. There are good examples of it being done around the world. And those are the things that innovation agendas need to start to take centre stage. But perhaps also we need to change actually the very way we create myths in innovation and who and how we celebrate. We tend to celebrate in our innovation conversations Jobs and Zuckerberg and Bezos and others whose aspirations are place-based, are place-free, they are global, they are not linked to the local. I do wonder if in the future we really need in conferences like this to be celebrating people we've never heard of from places we've never heard of and be taking inspiration for what it's possible to do locally, understanding the local challenges and conditions that get in the way of place-based innovation and figuring out how we overcome those. Because until we do that, we won't be transitioning to a world which is a truly collective future. Thank you.